back to another video. As you can tell by the title, today's video is a little more on the serious note compared to my other videos so far on here. But this is a topic I'm super passionate about and a topic I've always been really open and honest and vocal about on all of my other platforms. So I feel like as I'm starting to consistently post more and more on this channel, it's finally time to start throwing in some of these more serious videos just every once in a while. I'm not switching up my normal content. I just feel like these conversations are important. Before getting into the actual video, I feel like I need to start with just a handful of disclaimers. First off is a trigger warning. As you can tell by the title, today we are talking about eating disorder, more specifically binge eating disorder. You know your own boundaries and your own limits. If this video topic as a whole is triggering for you, I don't want to make anyone's current situation any worse. You know yourself, check in with yourself. If you think that listening to this would be detrimental, please skip it, or at least skip to a part where you know you could receive it better, if that makes sense. Second disclaimer, an obvious one. I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to be a doctor. I'm not trying to diagnose anyone or give anyone a plan for recovery or tell you what you should and shouldn't do. That is not why we're here today. I am simply here to share my own story and my own experience in hopes to relate to people and maybe help motivate people. It is by no means telling you what's right and what's wrong or anything in that realm. I'm probably going to say it a million times through this video, but everyone has such a different, unique experience with their own journey with food and their relationship with food and with themselves, so I'm only here to speak on my own and not anyone else's. Hi there, future Kendall checking in. And one thing I wanted to do before getting into the video was define what binge eating disorder actually is. I think knowledge is power, and I think knowing what the definition can be very useful. I also found several different definitions out there. This one seemed to be one of the more thorough, in-depth definition. So without further ado, BED is characterized by recurrent episodes of binge eating and eating large amount of food in a discrete period of time than most people would in the same situation. Other associated behaviors, including eating very rapidly, eating past the point of feeling full, eating when not hungry, and eating alone. This behavior is coupled with intense feelings of quote-unquote loss of control, overeating, shame, and guilt. BED is diagnosed when an individual engages in binge eating on average at least one day a week for 3 months. Now that the disclaimers are out of the way, the only thing I want to say before going into my own story is that if you're watching this, whether you are at the beginning of your journey or this is something you've been battling and trying to recover from for months or years at this point, just know wherever you're at in your journey, by watching this and watching other videos like this, you should honestly feel so proud of yourself. And I know it sounds cheesy, but I'm proud of you for even being here today, because I remember the hardest part of my journey was admitting to myself that I wanted and needed help and started seeking out education or hearing other people's experience. So if you're here and you're watching videos and content about this topic and you're trying to learn for you and your future self, just know that that is one of the biggest steps, and you should just be so happy and proud of how far you've already come by being here today. Okay, let's go a little bit into my story. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on this today, mostly because I'd rather spend this time talking about how I got out of binge eating, not really how I got into it. The only way I know how to classify my relationship with food as a child is as weird. I just always had a weird relationship with food and a weird obsession with food and my body. I did really competitive sports from a really young age, and sports were taken really seriously in my family. So I did figure skating, gymnastics, platform diving, pole vaulting. Those were my main sports growing up. And I don't know if it was ever told to me or if it was just like this unspoken thing, but in my head as a kid, I always saw these athletes of being in amazing shape. So I think I told myself, on top of maybe some coaches making comments here and there, that I needed to stay extremely fit in order to perform well in my sports. So I could never let myself go and I could never gain weight, because that would mean I wouldn't win and that I wouldn't perform well and that I wouldn't be a collegiate athlete and all of these things that I kind of put pressure on myself to be. For example, I remember I had to be 10, 11 years old maybe in gymnastics, and we had a nutritionist brought in on a regular basis to talk to us in like small group settings about calorie intake and macronutrients and food timing and all of these things that as a 10 or 11-year-old I shouldn't have even been aware of, and now I was so hyper fixated on. And so that's why I say my relationship with food was weird. I feel like I was just more aware of like things like calorie intake compared to my peers at school or my friends. And looking back, it's hard to say if that was the root of a lot of my binge eating in my later years, but I do think that's what kind of created that interesting dynamic with food. Like, I never viewed food like a normal kid did. And again, I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying that's how it was. So I definitely had some like weird tendencies with foods. I would closet eat a lot, like I would wait for my family to go to sleep just to go and grab some snacks. I also felt like weird anxiety sometimes asking for seconds and things like that. And it wasn't always good or always bad, it definitely ebbed and flowed throughout the years. There were some years where I never thought about it at all, and there were others where I was hyper fixated on my weight and my body and my food intake, and yeah. That was kind of through like elementary school, middle school. So flash forward to high school, that is when I started bodybuilding. For those of you who don't know, I did my first bodybuilding show when I was 17. So I would say 16, 17 years old is when I really got serious about bodybuilding and weight training. And in the beginning, bodybuilding felt like a cure-all, right? Because I feel like having almost that like forced structure of following a meal plan really helped my relationship with food for a while, because I was no longer obsessing over what I was eating. I was eating the same thing every single day. I had it pre-written out, pre-marked out. I was meal prepping all the time. My food habits became really good because I was forcing control over it. And that lasted a while, if I'm being honest. I did several shows where post-show was pretty easy. I had a great support system around me. I would have some refeed meals, some cheat meals. I never thought twice about it. Would I overeat now and then? For sure. I feel like that is normal. That is not what binge eating or BED is. And that was all until my last show. So my last show that I competed in was 2 years ago, 2021, almost 3 years ago now. That's crazy. So I had gotten home from nationals because it was out of state, and in the beginning everything seemed normal and actually really good. I remember feeling like I had a really good grasp over my food and my hunger cues and all of these things that, yes, my post shows were always pretty smooth until this one, but of course it's hard. Like, it's never easy post show, like, don't get me wrong. So this was the first time I was like, oh, this post show feels kind of easy. Like, oh, I have a great grasp on my hunger cues and my food and all of that, and boy was I wrong. But in the beginning that was true. I came home and I started reversing properly. I started just slowly adding more calories into my diet, but still eating like pretty bodybuilder-esque meals. I realized this was my first time being post-show and fully living alone. And so I realized I had no one looking over my shoulder, or no one checking in on me, or no one really forcing accountability or anything like that. And I slowly noticed my discipline start to slip. And it started slowly. I started with buying like little snacks here or there that I was craving, and I started going out to eat more and like ordering food to go or ordering DoorDash maybe once a week, and then that turned into every few days, and then that turned into every day, and then that turned into almost blacking out when I did these things and consuming thousands upon thousands of calories in one sitting. And every time I picked up snacks, I would eat them before I even got home, or every time I would order DoorDash, I would end up ordering from 3 different restaurants because I never felt like enough. I would almost black out, spend hundreds of dollars on food, eat thousands of calories, and then as I like came to after the fact is when I felt that traditional with binge eating, guilt and shame and embarrassment, and I would try to like grasp at straws, right? And the next day I would be like, you know, I'm not eating today. Starving myself is the answer. Or, oh, I'm gonna go do hours of cardio and that's gonna make up for everything I just did. Or I'm gonna take 3 times the dose of laxatives because that's gonna get all this food out of my system. Like, I know none of these things are rational. And for me and my story, it went way past just food. This was also the worst depressive episode I had ever been in, was along this timeline, and that could be its own video in itself. I'm not going to spend time going into that today, but I feel like my depression and my binge eating disorder together was ruining literally every aspect of my life. Not only were my thoughts being fully controlled, I spent 90% of my day thinking about food, and the other 10% was spent hating myself for these habits I was creating and how destructive I was being to myself right in front of my own eyes. But it also affected my relationships with absolutely everyone around me. I started self-isolation because I was so embarrassed about all this weight I was gaining that I didn't want to see my friends or family, and I didn't want to tell them what I was going through, so I just stopped responding to anyone, and I just fully hated who I was and who I was becoming. And I think that's why this part of my journey is so hard to talk about, because I blocked a lot of those memories and things that I did to myself and other people fully out of there. So now that you understand how I got there and kind of all the events that led up to, I would say, my absolute longest lasting worst binge eating episode I had ever been through, now I want to talk about the positive. How did I get out of that? Like I said earlier, and I really wasn't kidding, the reason why you should feel proud of yourself for even watching this video, I think the first step, which also happened to be the most important step for myself, was realizing that I had a problem and deciding that I not only needed, but that I wanted to get better. Because if you don't want to get better, you're gonna find every excuse in the book to stay where you're currently at. But if you have that true desire and want to get healthy and regulate these habits, that is the biggest step, because that means you're ready to start showing up for yourself and do what it does take to get to recovery and get to a healthy relationship with yourself and food again. So yeah, step number one was just being really honest with myself and figuring out where I wanted to be, and then kind of devising this plan from there of how am I going to do this. Step number two for me was educating myself. I feel like binge eating and eating disorders in general are sometimes thrown around, especially on social media, without a full understanding of what they were. So I started reading a lot of books. I started listening to a lot of podcasts, watching a lot of videos like this one I'm making now, and all of these other things that started to educate me on what it was I'm actually dealing with. And I feel like once you have an understanding of something, it's a lot easier to overcome instead of kind of going in blindly. And if you check the description, I'm gonna try to leave every single video, podcast, book, article, anything that helped me in my recovery. I'm gonna link it all down below so that hopefully you can find some new resources that might help you in your own journey. Two of the biggest. First one is the book Brain Over Binge by Katherine Hansen. That one changed my life. This was the first book I had read about binge eating while still experiencing binge eating, and Katherine does a great job of not making you feel alone in this situation. The beginning of this book is spent sharing her story similar to how I just did, just so you can fully grasp and understand that you're not alone in this situation. So I feel like that is super helpful because it makes you feel very seen. And then she goes into her own recovery, and again, it's just beautiful and motivational to hear that she was able to do it, and that made me really feel that I could do it too. My biggest takeaway from this book, and I recommend going and either reading it or listening to it on Audible because she's going to do a much better job explaining, but my biggest takeaway was that there are two sides to our brain. There's the animal brain and there's the human brain. The animal brain is exactly what it sounds like. It's that instinctual, unthinking, unconscious action part of our brain, while the human brain is the more developed, decision-making, rationally thinking side of our brain. And when she explains binge eating, she explains the fact that our animal brain is the part of our brain that gives into those binges, and that's why we feel like we almost black out or aren't conscious or aren't fully aware or thinking while we're binging. I feel like making that disconnect and almost being able to blame the binge eating on my animalistic brain made it so much easier in the rest of my recovery, because I just had to view it as this entity that wasn't a part of me. Because for so long I was viewing it as I am this disorder. Binge eating disorder is me, when in reality it is something that isn't a part of you. It is something that you can't overcome, but sometimes that is so hard to feel or visualize when you're going through it. So yeah, thinking about the two different sides of the brain and remembering that I have the power to be in my human brain to overcome my animal brain really helped me. Highly recommend that book. Again, it'll be down below. The next educational content that really helped me was Dr. Huberman's podcast, and even today I listen to a lot of his episodes, and he is just so well spoken and well educated and does a great job explaining why we do some of the things we do. He had this great episode on our brain and dopamine, and how if we reward ourselves with food, we tie dopamine to food, and how we can create these false senses of euphoria through eating, and that a lot of people that do develop binge eating disorder have that false sense of dopamine levels, and we're constantly chasing that high. And I am fully butchering that, so please, again, go listen to the actual podcast. But I remember that one being so transformational for myself to hear, because again, it was just a very rational, logistic way to think about this, instead of just having these feelings and not being able to define any of it or know why I was doing what I was doing to myself. So now I was at a place where I was self-aware, I was being honest with myself, and I was learning. In that education obviously came with a lot of steps of their own, of implementing different skills or implementing different thoughts into my daily routine, but I'm just gonna share my absolute biggest. So my step number 3, I'm gonna use the umbrella term of practicing mindfulness. And this, again, of course, could mean a million things. And under this umbrella of mindfulness came a lot of practices that I did on a daily basis that really, really aided in my recovery. And I'm gonna quickly try to bullet point all of them. So I feel like these mindful practices as a whole were, again, just trying to get myself back to my human brain instead of acting fully off of impulse and using my animal brain for decisions. First are the basics that I feel like we all think of when we hear mindful practices, like journaling and meditation. But truly, both of those really helped me come back to myself and center with myself, and again, just be realistic and honest with myself. And in journaling, a lot of what I was able to discover were my triggers. I was able to start picking up on patterns and behavioral habits and figure out, how do I feel when I binge? How do I feel before it? What's causing it? Where am I? What am I doing? Who am I with? What am I having? What foods are triggering me? All of these questions that if I wasn't sitting down and trying to find those answers, it would be a lot harder to come up with solutions for. And I feel like once you're being realistic with yourself and you're able to identify your triggers, which is huge and super beneficial. If you haven't done that yet, that is probably the only thing I'm gonna fully recommend out of this video, is to sit down and figure out what triggers you, and not just what foods trigger you, but what environments trigger you. So I'm gonna talk directly on one of my personal triggers, because I feel like that's a really easy way to visualize how I was able to find this trigger, and then from there backtrack and implement different mindful practices in order to stop that trigger from causing a binge episode like it used to. So for me, a huge one was eating in the car. I would go to the grocery store, or I would pick up food, and I would either sit in the parking lot of the grocery store and eat absolutely everything I just ate, or I would snack on everything on my drive home. And time after time, I would finish the entirety of my whole grocery list for the whole week before I even got home with it. I would finish it all in the car. So since this was a really, really common pattern for myself, this one was really easy to identify. So I was able to practice mindfulness in a few different ways here. The first thing I started doing was writing a list. I used to go into the grocery store completely blind and just buy all the things I was craving. And of course, if you're giving into the things you're craving on that level while dealing with BED, there's like a 99% chance you're gonna binge eat on that food. So I think it was better to make my grocery list when I was at home, not super hungry, in my human brain, conscious of what I was writing down. And in making this list, I was able to identify, okay, what foods do I typically binge eat on? What foods are triggers for me? Let's leave that out of the list and make sure I don't buy it. I think most practices throughout my recovery were just trying to buy myself some extra time. Because when you have extra time and an extra moment to sit with your thoughts, it gives you an extra opportunity to choose to do the right thing instead of give into your binge impulses. So for an example here, I know if I went to the grocery store and I bought cereal, cereal was a huge trigger food for me. I would sit in my car, eat the whole box of cereal before even going home. Now, if it wasn't on my list and I don't buy it and it's not in my home, if I was craving cereal and wanted to binge on cereal, I would have this added step of having to get into my car, drive to the store, buy it, drive home, and then binge eat. That gives you so much extra time and room to rationally think and more opportunities to think about what you're doing before you actually do it, instead of just buying it off the bat and giving into that craving and that impulse, because that was only ever feeding my food addiction. And it's almost like going into battle with no armor and no weapons. Like, you're setting yourself up for failure by not being mindful about these little things. So like I said, making a grocery list was huge, leaving trigger foods off of that list for obvious reasons. And then the second thing I started implementing, whether I bought my groceries myself, which I still usually opted for, even though I think an even better step looking back might have been ordering my groceries ahead of time. That way there is literally no room for error when it comes to picking out your food. But either way, I ensured that my groceries were going directly into my trunk, because again, we need to buy time for ourselves and our minds to create room to practice patience and practice decision making. So if all of my groceries were in the passenger seat, it is so much easier to just grab it, crack something open, and start eating, instead of having all of my food in the trunk, which now I have to consciously take my seatbelt off, open the door, walk around my car, open my trunk, find what I'm looking for just to get back in and then binge eat. So again, you're just buying yourself time, and I promise in doing those little steps that give yourself the opportunity to wake your human brain up, it makes it so much easier to control those impulsive thoughts. So finally, now I was at a point where I could make it home with my food. I wasn't binge eating in the car anymore. So I would come home with my groceries, and again, I would make it a mindful effort to put all of my food up. I don't care if I was super hungry and it was time to eat. I was putting everything up into their spots, because that kept me from just eating based on how I was feeling in the moment and not rationally thinking. Now it was all put away. Now I could think about, okay, what do I want to eat? What am I feeling right now? Let me prepare that meal instead of just grabbing the first thing I see and eating all of it. And then the last piece of mindfulness, and this could be used, I feel like, for everyone in everyone's situation, and that's practicing mindful eating. So now I was practicing mindfulness in my buying habits and my timing habits. But of course, we're still gonna have to eat. Eating is healthy, eating is good for you. Please do not take the route of, oh, I'm just gonna go on the flip side and not eat anything. That is not a solution. I think it's just important to be mindful when you eat. When you have the TV on and you sit down with a bag of chips, I guarantee everyone can relate to this, that you blink and that bag of chips is gone. And that's because you're not conscious and in your body and paying attention to what you're doing, or the motions of it, or the taste of it, or the feeling of it. You don't even know that you're full because you're distracted. I made it a priority to be conscious with my food intake. So I would not eat on the couch. I would not watch anything or listen to anything, because again, that was a huge habit for myself, was to throw on YouTube or a podcast and be mindless when eating. This forced mindfulness, because now it's just you and the food in silence, and practicing patience within that, and practicing being in your body within that. I feel like that's where meditation can really play a role. I'm not saying I sat there and meditated every time I would eat, but I did try to be as in my body and as connected to myself as I could be in those moments. And then it's like breaking down the little things. And I know some of this might sound silly, but if you are someone who has been through this, I know you can relate. But it was about slowing down and actually enjoying my food and tasting my food and gauging as I was eating what was good, what wasn't, what's making me full, what isn't, how full am I getting? Just all of these questions that I, for so long, wasn't caring about, because I know that uncontrollable impulse of when you sit down with a plate of food or with a bunch of snacks, you have this uncontrollable urge to eat everything as fast as you can and not even enjoy it. You just feel the need to eat it. And this step back, this forced slow down, really put food and your brain into perspective, because I was finally able to connect with my body and gauge how I was feeling while eating, instead of almost like coming to after a binge episode. Hi guys, Future Kendall popping in yet again. I forgot to tell you guys one of the tools that I still use literally every day, even now, that helped me so much throughout recovery. And it falls under mindful eating, so I thought I would just slip it in here. And that is the act of making my foods voluminous. I feel like a lot of the times we eat with our eyes, and if you are so used to binge eating and so used to having such high quantity of foods, completely eliminating that part of your habit off the bat can be super duper hard and cause you to be really hungry and have all of these out of whack hunger cues and never feel satiated and all of that stuff. I had to keep my food and my meals very high volume because that not only made my mind at ease, it also really did help me stay satiated throughout my journey. So what I mean by that, just to give you a little example, if one of my meals was typically, let's just say, 1 cup of rice and 1 cup of chicken, instead of what I would typically do is like just put that one on top of each other in a small bowl. Now you can't even see everything you're eating, so the quantity looks and feels very small, and as soon as you're done, you're hungry again. How I started implementing more volume is instead of putting it in this small bowl, I would opt more for a plate and still put that 1 cup of chicken and 1 cup of rice. But now, first off, I can now see all of the food I'm about to eat, which, like I said before, really helps that mental aspect of eating more food. And even then, I would take it one step further. But I would usually add a lot of different types of vegetables onto the plate, oftentimes like lettuce or like a side salad. And that had so many added benefits. Like I said, it really mentally helped me now visualize my food intake being a lot larger. The fiber in those veggies is also amazing for your digestive tract, and it kept me fuller longer. So all of these benefits just by adding more volume to my meals. And like I said, that's something I still do today. I like to make the joke that I can turn any meal into a salad, and I really do. And by no means am I like substituting veggies in for my carbs. My carbs are always still there. I just like to add everything on top of lettuce or on top of veggies because, like I said before, it just makes the meal larger, more filling, more satiating. And just in case that's something you've never thought of or tried before, I feel like I really needed to add that one in there because it seriously did help my eating habits and my hunger cues. So those are the main mindfulness practices. Can apply to other triggers out there. Just to give one extra example before moving on is the fact that ordering from apps was like a huge trigger for me because, again, it just made the act of binge eating so accessible that I didn't even have time to think about what I was doing. It was just a click of the button and boom, the pizza was on my front doorstep. So a big one for me was to delete these accounts and delete these apps where I was ordering my food from. So I got rid of like DoorDash, Uber Eats, all of those things I had to take off of my phone because then again, now it's an added step of having to go to the app store, download the app, put in my information, put in my credit card information, order the food. All of these added steps gave me time and space to come to and realize this wasn't a decision I actually wanted to make for my future self. The next step that I took was talking to someone, telling someone. Yes, of course, I could imagine I could have recovered all by myself without voicing it to anyone. But I also recognize how much easier my recovery became as soon as I was open and honest with the people around me about what I was going through. I became super isolated through my binge eating disorder. I was so embarrassed and ashamed, and I didn't want to see or talk to or tell anyone what I was dealing with. But the first person I ended up reaching out to was my mom, and we are super close, and this was the one part of our relationship I was hiding from her because, again, just fear of how she would view me differently or whatever I was telling myself at the time. And I remember the second I told her, all she ever was supportive and wanting to help me and wanting to aid in my recovery, and she even offered to pay for an online counselor and therapist for me, and I would call her after every single session and we would talk about all of these new discoveries I was making. And I don't know if I could have recovered as quickly as I did if I didn't have her by my side. So I will always recommend talking to someone. And if you don't have anyone to immediately talk to, hire a counselor like I did. I hired someone off of BetterHelp, and they gave me a new perspective and someone I could voice what I was dealing with to, telling these people or this person that I was getting recovery. And so I felt this new accountability of actually showing up for myself and not just doing it for me anymore, but doing it for my relationships with these people. The last step I'm going to talk about, and again, I have many steps I could easily get into today, but I don't want this video being 10 hours long and overwhelming with information, so just gonna end it after this one. And the last step that helped me a lot was practicing patience and grace. Recovery is not gonna happen overnight. Recovery is also not linear. It's not gonna always be one step after another. Every day you're improving. There's gonna be hard days. There's gonna be times where you most likely do binge again and give into your impulses again. I think it's more about focusing on your wins than focusing on your losses, because trust me, I know how easy that guilt shame spiral can pick up again. So it is so important to focus on the win, that maybe even though you did give into binge eating, maybe you took the time to pause. Maybe you took the time to be mindful before that happened. You took 10 extra minutes before giving into that urge. That is still a win. I promise every single time you choose to not binge eat, it becomes easier the next time around. So give yourself grace, give yourself patience. Recovery does take time. It might take weeks, it might take months, it might even take years, and there is no limit to getting back on track. I don't care if you're 2 months into recovery, you slip up, you start spiraling back into binge eating, and now you feel like you're too far gone and not worth helping anymore. Trust me, it is never too late. Give yourself grace. We are only human, and just try your best to go back onto your track and onto a plan. That is all I have for steps and some of my biggest tips. Please let me know if you do want a part 2. I'm happy to share a lot more in depth on a lot of these things. I just wanted to keep it pretty digestible and pretty simple to start. As you can tell, the video is not over. We still got some time going on the bar. And that is because I actually had you guys ask me questions over on my Instagram story pertaining directly to binge eating and BED. And when I tell you guys, if this is any sort of proof at how common and how you are not alone in this issue, I was expecting maybe 5 to 10 responses, hundreds. There were hundreds of people that reached out and answered this story, and I feel like that is proof enough that this is a topic that is not only so prevalent and common, but that it's also not talked about enough. So if you are out there and you're watching this and you're alone and you haven't told anyone that you're struggling, just know that you are not alone in that. I had so many amazing vulnerable stories in my DMs and in the questions box. So if you are someone that did ask a question, thank you for being open with me. I know that that's super challenging. And I also want to apologize in advance if I don't answer your question today. I'm just gonna pick the questions that I noticed were the most commonly asked. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the questions. We all know I am quite the rambler, so I'm gonna try my best to be pretty concise with my answers instead of just going off the deep end like I usually do. Do you currently track macros or follow a meal plan? No. I intuitively eat, which if we're being honest is just eating. I felt like tracking macros and following meal plans was not good for me, and again, everyone is different. I think it's amazing for certain people. I think I was being so hard on myself and so mean to myself if I wasn't 100% accurate with my macros and my meal plan, that if I ever slipped up, it was like the end of the world, and that again would start up that spiral of hating myself and binge eating and all of these negative things that came with that. So for me personally, I just eat. I eat what I would consider what a normal person eats. Are my meals still healthy? Yeah. But do I go and buy candy if I'm craving candy? Yeah. Do I eat the whole bag like I used to? No. And again, this took lots and lots and lots of practice, but no, in short, I do not follow anything. I care about my protein intake. I am gluten and dairy free, so it's not like my daily meals are anything crazy. And if you told old Kendall that, she'd probably poop her pants. So again, took a very long time to thankfully be in the spot I am now and have this relationship with food that I have now. The next question is, do you have any tips on how to tell a loved one that you're struggling? I'm gonna use the example of my mom because like I said before, she was the first person I told, and I did definitely have to hype myself up to tell her I was terrified. I had to reflect on, why am I scared? What am I scared of? What is the worst that could happen? And I think we have fear of being vulnerable because we're scared that the people on the receiving end won't understand, or they'll make fun of us, or whatever your reasoning is. I think if you're fully open and transparent and asking for help or asking for support, if the person you're telling is at least half of a decent human being, they're gonna be there for you. No one's just gonna leave you hanging, and no one's gonna judge you and make fun of you. They just want you happy and healthy. If you're being vulnerable, odds are you're gonna be met with more vulnerability. You don't know how many people I've told about my past with BED that have told me that they are currently or have gone through the exact same thing. You never know how that person might relate to what you're going through. And then my second actual piece of advice would be ready to educate them. The same way you have to educate yourself on these topics, I think you need to be ready to teach them what exactly you're going through, what binge eating is, what they could do to support and maybe help you through your recovery if that's something that you need. I'll put the link down below with all of my other links, but there was a video that literally very basically explained what BED was, and I remember sending that to my mom and being like, here it is. Here's the definition. This gives you a rough understanding of what I feel on a regular basis right now, so that she was able to understand my struggles. The next question is, when you binge during a caloric deficit, did you overcompensate with cardio or did you just go back on your routine? Do not listen to what I used to do, because of course I overcompensated with cardio. I thought that was gonna fix it all, and then turns out, guess what? It doesn't. All you need to do, this is again, like one of the only things I am saying matter-of-factly in this whole video, all you need to do is get back onto your routine. I don't care if it's been 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 22 years. I don't care how long it's been. It is never too late to get back on track, and I say that wholeheartedly because when you try to overcompensate, when you try to do anything that's going to counteract what you did the day before, you're only going to make your own mental health and physical health worse and harder to get back on track. If you just get back on track, it's as simple as that. And if you don't have a routine, it is also never too late to make a new one. Make a new routine, write it out, and stick to it. I don't care what that routine is, but creating healthy habits and healthy routines is all you need to do to get back on track for yourself. The next question is, how did you deal with body changes? This one I think is super circumstantial. EDs don't look a certain way. Someone with binge eating disorder could be underweight, overweight, appearing healthy. You could really be any shape and size and still be struggling. So I'm gonna speak for my own. Like I said before, I was post-show when I was in the thick of my BED, and I went from being roughly 150 pounds on stage to being, the highest I weighed in was 200 pounds 3 or 4 months post-show. So in 3 or 4 months, I gained 50 pounds and I was extremely uncomfortable in my own skin. For my own body, just doing that drastically, it was a lot of inflammation. I was super swollen, and it was personally for me the heaviest I had ever weighed, and that was so hard to see, and I wasn't healthy anymore, and that was really hard to face. And so during my recovery, all I kept repeating to myself is, Kendall, get back to healthy. All I ever wanted to be was healthy. I didn't care if I never had abs again, if I lost a bunch of muscle. I didn't care what that looked like. All I wanted was to be healthy and comfortable in my own skin again. So just focus and remind yourself that you are becoming healthy and your body is going to change, but those changes are good. And eventually they will level out and they will regulate. But at the time, all that matters is you becoming healthy again, your internal health, your hormones, your joints, your body is becoming healthy, and that is what is important. Last one I'm gonna answer is, what is the first thing you would tell someone who is experiencing binge episodes daily? The absolute first thing I would tell you is that you're not alone, and I feel like this video and all of these questions are proof enough that other people are dealing with the exact same feelings you are dealing with, and I know it is so hard to feel that way in the moment, but just remember that you're not alone, and hundreds and thousands of people have recovered and gotten from where you currently are to having a great relationship with themselves and foods. Use that. Use that as motivation that you are also capable of doing that. Show up for yourself. You are worth showing up for. You are worth getting better for. You are worth feeling good every day, okay? And whatever your circumstances are, I hope you are okay. And I am fully sitting here supporting you and praying for your own recovery. That is all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you made it to this part of the video, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for hearing what I have to say about this topic. And again, if you want a part 2, please let me know. I truly love talking about these things. And I know I'm a little nervous, so fingers crossed everything came across how I intended it to. But like I said, all the resources are down below, and if you have any other specific questions, feel free to comment or DM me. I love you all so much. Love you, bye!